Committee will come to order, quorum being present. Committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 1010 to provide that the rule entitled Short-Term Limited Duration Insurance shall have no force or effect. Now, first, the Chair announces that any request for recorded votes may be rolled pursuant to Clause 2, Rule 11 of the House Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 13B. Committee may recess the committee at any point without objection, so ordered. At this time, I must instruct members on a change in committee practice. Since the last markup of this committee, the Parliamentarian's Office contacted the committee staff after watching our markup and looking at our website, noting that the roll call vote tallies announced at the markup and the tallies reflected on the website did not match. They called to inquire why. Committee staff explained the long-time committee practice of permitting members to add their vote to the clerk's tally sheet at the end of a markup so long as it does not change the final outcome of a vote. This has been a courtesy extended to members on both sides of the aisle, regardless of who has been in the majority, and a practice that's, to my understanding, been going on for years. Unfortunately, the committee staff was instructed by the Parliamentarian's Office that they were not aware of the practice. I don't know where they've been. That it cannot be permitted, and the committee must cease this practice immediately. Therefore, the committee is altering the practice to one that is permitted by the Parliamentarian's Office. As before, members who miss a vote during a markup may approach the clerk at the end of a markup while the clerk is still at the desk in the hearing room to indicate how the member would have voted if they had been present to the vote, and their voting preference will be indicated on the roll call sheet. However, the difference is that the vote will not be counted in the tally. While the chair understands the competing demands of members' time and recognizes that often multiple committees are meeting at the same time and members are required to go back and forth and occasionally will miss a vote, the chair obviously strongly encourages members to be present for all votes. Now, I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today we're here for a legislative markup of H.R. 1010 to provide that the rule entitled Short-Term Limited Duration Insurance shall have no force or effect. This bill would shield Americans from higher health care costs and strengthen patient protections by halting the expansion of short-term health plans. I'd like to thank Congressman Desaulniers and Congresswoman Underwood for their leadership as original co-sponsors of the bill that would stem the proliferation of low-quality health plans and ensure that we have access to protect that we can protect access to affordable quality care. On October 12, 2017, President Trump signed an executive order calling for the expansion of health care plans that do not provide basic consumer protections required under the Affordable Care Act. Less than a year later, the Departments of Health and Human Services, Labor, and the Department of Treasury jointly published a final rule extending the allowable duration of short-term, limited-duration insurance plans from 3 months to up to a year, with plans being renewable for up to 3 years. Increasing use of short-term plans will have the harmful consequences for all Americans. These plans, often referred to as junk plans, leave consumers without the Affordable Care Act protections that we now take for granted. For example, these plans can deny consumers coverage or charge them more based on their age, gender, or health status, more than they're charging now, provide no guarantee of coverage for essential benefits such as maternity care, mental health, prescriptive drug coverage, or preventive services, are not subject to the out-of-pocket limits that protect consumers from high health care costs, and are not subject to rules that ensure premiums go mostly towards actual health care expenses and not advertising and executive bonuses. These plans often provide no protections for patients with pre-existing conditions. Short-term plans can retroactively rescind or deny coverage for care that may stem from a pre-existing condition. One plan even defined a pre-existing condition as a prior condition that would, quote, cause a reasonable person to seek diagnosis, care, or treatment, even if the person had not previously sought medical care for that condition. In many cases, consumers purchasing short-term plans are not even aware of these risks because the Trump administration is allowing short-term plans to be sold alongside plans that comply with federal consumer protections. A recent survey shows that most consumers increasingly expect their health insurance to automatically reflect the ACA's consumer protections. They only discover the fine print when they're hit with unexpected, unaffordable health care expenses. Worse yet, the consequences of these plans are not limited to those who purchase the plans. Junk short-term plans lure relatively young and healthy people away from the general insurance pool. This makes premiums more expensive for the majority of Americans who need strong protections and comprehensive coverage provided by the ACA. Then, when consumers using junk plans get sick and find out their coverage is inadequate, they go back into the general insurance pool, further driving up costs for everybody else. That simple reality of health insurance, which Republican health care proposals continue to ignore, is that you cannot have strong consumer protections and affordable costs without requiring universal comprehensive coverage. Congress must protect all Americans' access to affordable health care by rejecting these attempts to undermine the ACA and threaten the coverage that people with pre-existing conditions have come to expect. During our first hearing in this Congress, witnesses revealed how short-term plans threatened the health care coverage of workers with pre-existing conditions and our health care system overall. We've also heard from more than 300 patient and consumer advocates, physician and provider organizations, and other stakeholders who voiced their opposition to expanding these junk plans. Short-term health care plans are a remnant of our old health care system before Congress passed the ACA. They're a reminder of a time when federal law allowed insurers to deny people with coverage, put annual or lifetime limits on health care coverage, or charge unaffordable premiums, and then spend a large share of those premiums rewarding executives. This is why we're considering H.R. 1010 today. This bill nullifies the administration's rule expanding the allowable duration of short-term plans. It would prevent short-term plans from undermining consumer protections and increasing health care costs for everybody else. This legislation before us today will ensure that we do not go back and that all Americans with or without pre-existing conditions have access to affordable, quality care that they need to live healthy and fulfilling lives. Our colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee have already acted to pass a number of bills that would undo some of the sabotage that is threatening consumers, particularly those with pre-existing conditions. Today, this committee will do the same. I strongly encourage all members of the committee to support H.R. 1010 and now yield to the ranking member of the committee, Dr. Fox.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. It is unfortunate that you chose not to consider fully this committee's interest and important stake in the House Democrat version of the Violence Against Women Act before it made it to the House floor last week. And before that, H.R. 1. You've deemed this one-sentence Democratic attack on the administration worthy of the full committee's consideration without a hearing on the bill. Nevertheless, the fact that a bill referred primarily to the Energy and Commerce Committee, followed by this committee and the Ways and Means Committee, is being considered here today is still worth noting. At the risk of sounding like the college instructor I used to be, I'll give you partial credit, Mr. Chairman. This committee has jurisdiction over employer-sponsored health care. Our focus should be on improving those options, but rather than focus on this priority, we're here today to consider H.R. 1010, which would eliminate short-term limited duration insurance plans. These plans are an obvious potential solution for millions of Americans, working or not, who may find themselves between jobs or unable to afford rising premiums in the already expensive individual markets. Democrats conveniently failed to mention that short-term limited duration plans were legal under the Obama administration, and that states still have the authority to regulate these plans, both under the Obama administration and under the current rules. If states choose to limit or prohibit the sale of these plans, they are free to do so. By considering this bill, House Democrats are reiterating that they favor one-size-fits-all federal mandates instead of respecting the judgment of state lawmakers and authorities to act in their state's best interest. One of the worst examples of Big Brother I've ever seen. If House Democrats want to attempt to codify and enshrine in the law for posterity their obsession with taking away affordable health insurance options, leaving hardworking Americans with fewer choices and higher premiums. That's certainly an option for them. Republicans on this committee remain fully dedicated to protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions and unleashing new, customizable, affordable, workable health care options that take into account the changing needs of all Americans at all stages of life. H.R. 1010 is a one-sentence bill that will not lower drug prices, will not protect anyone from surprise billing, will not lower premiums, will not cut any out-of-pocket costs, and will not provide 1 cent of tax relief. Its failure to achieve any of those objectives makes it simply unacceptable to us as Republicans. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Without objection, all members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of today. Pursuant to Committee Rule 12E and as discussed at the committee's organizational meeting, priority will be given to amendments submitted to the committee at least 24 hours in advance, and amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the bill, H.R. 1010, for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 1010, to provide that the rule entitled Short-Term Limited Duration Insurance shall have no effect or no force or effect.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The reading of the bill for amendment, the clerk will again designate the bill for amendment.
H.R. 1010, to provide that the rule entitled Short-Term Limited Duration Insurance shall have no force or effect.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Any amendment offered shall be considered as read. Committee will now move for consideration of amendments to the roster, and I thank Dr. Rowe for agreeing to the roster. This allows more time for the amendments to be given full consideration. Recognize Dr. Rowe for the purposes of an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1010 offered by Mr. David P. Rowe of Tennessee.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, I now reserve a point of order.
The point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is simple. It strikes all the current text of the bill and replaces it with language that codifies the short-term limited duration insurance rule and allows for guaranteed renewability. Why do we want to codify and strengthen these plans? Quite simply, these health insurance plans guarantee access to an essential benefits package picked out by the patient, not the government. On August 3rd, 2018, the Trump administration released the final rule returning the definition of the STLDI plans to what it was before President Obama's 11th hour definition change in January of 2017, allowing renewability for up to 36 months. The Obama administration's rule overturned 20 years of regulations by limiting these plans to only 3 months. Instead of working to make health care more affordable for Americans without employer-sponsored health insurance coverage, President Obama decided to decrease availability, affordable options, and limit the length of time a consumer can maintain a short-term limited plan. Thankfully, the Trump administration acted in August of 2018 to revert definition to a short-term limited duration insurance plan back to what it was for the prior 20 years, including the entire Obama administration, to create more flexibility and affordability in the healthcare marketplace. You may hear some of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle label these as, quotes, junk plans, end quotes, except they were available in the current form during President Obama's entire time in office, and none of my colleagues at that time called them junk plans that I recall. What is a junk plan? One that doesn't provide superfluous coverage that you don't need, What do seniors do with Medicare Advantage or Part D? They buy the plan that meets their needs, not some government mandate. In my state, Medicare Part D has 29 options for Tennesseans to buy prescription drug coverage. I understand my colleagues in the majority believe changes are not needed to the ACA, but it's easy to see that it's failing many Americans. In my district, about 20,000 individuals purchased their insurance through the exchange with a subsidy, but roughly 15,000 individuals paid the penalty. 15,000 people in my district paid a fine because they couldn't afford it. And why'd they do that? Because of sky-high annual premiums, high deductibles, and government-mandated benefits that patients don't need or want. These plans often provide you nothing more than a card in your wallet. And for full disclosure, I have ACA insurance. I'm insured by that plan. In contrast, these short-term plans are really essential health benefits. They're just essential health benefits that the patient deems to be essential to them and their family. Look, we all have different needs at different points in our lives. I understand that. My wife and I don't need maternity coverage at this point in our lives, for instance. And I thank goodness for that. Because the ACA prevents policies from being sold that are tailored to an individual that have an affordable option for consumers since the Clinton administration. This committee and Congress as a whole should be looking for ways to make health coverage more affordable for Americans, not working to eliminate coverage options that have been available in this form since the 1990s. And Mr. Chairman, just to pass along, another, this is not germane today, but the Association Health Plans. I was in Washington State, and the state has a Association Health Plans, 8 different plans that have been functioning well for over 20 years in that state to help lower costs and increase access. And look, I agreed with that with the ACA, that we should lower costs of health insurance coverage and increase access. The problem is the ACA hasn't done that. If you get a huge subsidy, it helps you. If you do not, it may be completely unaffordable. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time has expired. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. The fact that recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. First of all, the gentleman's right. People who are healthy can form these associations and save some money. But simple arithmetic dictates that when you take healthy people out of the pool is sicker, and everybody else will pay more. The fact that the gentleman mentioned that you don't have to buy superfluous benefits, like he doesn't need maternity benefits. When maternity benefits cease to become an essential benefit that everybody pays for, whether you need it or not, then who will order this kind of benefit? Those that expect to have a baby in the next 12 months. You stop paying for insurance and you start paying essentially prepaid maternity care. And for those that expect to have a baby, their policies will go to have this little extra benefit, will go up thousands of dollars every year. That's why everybody just pays average. Whether you need it or not, everybody pays average, so those that actually need that benefit can afford it. You would not otherwise be able to afford maternity care if it became an optional benefit. Those with pre-existing conditions, you can find a group with no pre-existing conditions, they'll pay less. When somebody gets sick, then the association will disband, everybody jumps back in the pool. Everybody essentially would have been providing backup coverage for those who are enjoying lower fees. And when they need it, then they come back and with a sicker pool, add to everybody else and run up everybody else's costs. There are certain protections that are enjoyed under the Affordable Care Act that these programs do not provide. For example, the Affordable Care Act prohibits insurance companies from canceling or rescinding coverage when you get sick. There's no such benefit. Plans would be able to underwrite based on health status. If you've got a pre-existing condition, they can charge you more. You can't do that today. Even with the amendment, other key provisions like essential health benefits covering everything you need, and a ban on lifetime and annual benefits. those protections are not in these short-term plans. And so I would hope we would, if we ever get to a vote, the parliamentarian has indicated that this amendment is not germane, but this would be a bad amendment if it were germane. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Does anyone else wish to speak on it? Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard your comments in your opening comments about why we don't need short-term duration plans, and you said we need to shield Americans from high-cost health insurance and provide them affordable quality plans. Well, I think we have plenty of evidence now through Obamacare that we're not shielding Americans from high-cost health insurance with that plan. And in fact, by offering short-term duration plans, we are able to allow people to make choices. I've said this many times before. I am puzzled, absolutely puzzled, by the Democrats wanting to deny choice to the people in this country on everything except the choice to kill babies. Americans should have the choice to choose whatever health care plan they want to choose. And if they're approved by the states, then that indicates that somebody in a very responsible position has looked at these plans and believes that they are right. And I agree with Congressman Rowe. Essential health benefits are in the eye of the beholder. The Democrats have decided that older people should buy maternity care. Unmarried people should buy maternity care. There are lots of things that people have to pay for. And as the chairman has said, by allowing young and healthy people not to buy from the ACA, you are taking them, they are leaving the pool, and the chairman said it drives up the cost for everyone else. Well, it's actuarial science, Mr. Chairman. Health insurance costs, all insurance costs, are based on actuarial science. And why should young and healthy people be subsidizing the cost of health care because of the federal government's requiring it for other people? That isn't the way this government operates. We don't tell everybody what car insurance they have to buy or what homeowners insurance they have to buy. We don't do that. Hopefully that'll never happen. I don't want to put any ideas into your head, but we leave that choice up to people. And you know what? I have a lot of confidence in the American people. I believe they're smart enough to make the decisions as to whether they want short-term health care insurance or they want long-term, and they want to buy into the socialistic kind of ideas that are being pushed by this Congress. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Blond?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Is that my time? Okay, thank you. Now that I have 5 minutes, I yield to the chairman, Mr. Scott.
Thank you. And I'd just like to make a couple of points. It's easy to complain. The Affordable Care Act was very complicated. It did a lot of good, didn't solve all the problems, and it's one thing to talk about the problems, but it's also interesting to note what happens when you try to come up with an alternative. The alternative, the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act, passed by the House a couple of years ago, was studied by the Congressional Budget Office. It found that if that thing became law, 20-some million fewer people would have insurance. The cost would go up 20% the first year. There were no guarantee of essential benefits, and those with pre-existing conditions would start losing the protections they have. That's the alternative, and that's the direction that these short-term plans go in. And I'd like to yield back to the gentleman, Mr. Sablon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I continue to insist on the point of order.
Thank you. Chair is prepared to rule on the point of order.
Mr.
Does
Chairman.
someone speak to the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this point of order reveals this markup for the waste of time that it is. This committee does not have jurisdiction to amend the underlying law related to short-term limited duration insurance plan. So why are we here today? The majority's bill is looking to eliminate the common sense historical definition of the STLDI plan. But when I offer an amendment codifying that and allowing for renewability, it's determined not to be germane. The House Energy and Commerce Committee, which does have jurisdiction over the underlying law, has already marked up this bill. Instead of keeping members here to mark up a bill for a law over which this committee has no jurisdiction, we should just adjourn. I don't see why we're here.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the willingness to debate healthcare, but this amendment is not germane as it violates the statute not amended by the bill test.
Thank you. Chair is prepared to rule. The gentlewoman has made a point of order that the amendment is not germane because it violates the statute not amended by the bill test pursuant to Deschler-Brown, Chapter 28, Section 42. A point of order may lie against an amendment if it amends either directly or by implication a law that is not contemplated under the bill in the bill under consideration. The amendment amends the Public Health Service Act. The underlying measure does not amend any statute, therefore it is not an order to amend an existing law. Chair finds that the amendment is not germane because it violates the statute not amended by the bill test. Moreover, the chair has conferred with the parliamentarian's office on the language in the amendment, and the parliamentarian's office agrees with this assessment. For that reason, the point of order is sustained and the amendment is ruled out of order. Are there other amendments? Mr. Johnson?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1010 offered by Mr. Johnson.
Gentlelady from Oregon reserves a point of order. Gentleman from, Mr. Johnson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, a number of my colleagues in the room know me pretty well, so I suspect that it's no surprise to them that I would offer something like this. I believe in federalism. I believe in allowing states, the 50 laboratories of democracy, the opportunity to innovate. I think over time we find better solutions when we avoid the one-size-fits-all approach. And let's be honest, H.R. 1010 is a one-size-fits-all approach. The amendment that I bring forth, I think, tries to provide some additional flexibility surrounding that. So to set the stage historically, under the existing rules, and frankly, under the rules that were in place for almost the entirety of President Obama's term, states had the ability to regulate the sale of these short-term limited duration plans, which are not a panacea, but for some people in some instances can be a good tool for them to access when they need care, when they need coverage. And so that state authority included the ability to prohibit or restrict sales, to determine whether or not the policies should contain one set of services or another. That was really the consumer protection authority that states were using. And that's called federalism. And that is something that I think all of us here should respect and should embrace. What is good for my state might not be good for yours. And some innovation at the state level can be good long-term for the entire country. So looking at the bill before us today, it appears that some of my colleagues disagree with empowering states. And that's why they're pursuing this one-size-fits-all mandated coverage. So the amendment before this committee right now would simply add a section that allows states to opt out of this federal overreach by submitting a request to the secretaries. This would respect the judgment of state lawmakers. And let's remember, these folks have been elected just like we have been. They want to act in their state's best interest. They have been authorized by their voters to do so. This amendment would give them the flexibility to continue to determine what would serve their states best. I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I would urge them to support federalism. I would urge them to continue to support the kind of innovation that we should have at the 50 laboratories of democracy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time has expired. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for holding this markup of H.R. 1010, an incredibly straightforward and meaningful bill that will reverse the administration's harmful short-term limited duration insurance rule, which was released by Health and Human Services last July. Simply put, this administration's insurance rule is yet another attempt to roll back the Affordable Care Act. These plans, especially when extended beyond 3 months, are essentially the predatory lending of the healthcare market, misleading consumers and ultimately undercutting the Affordable Care Act. To the administration, the ACA isn't about protecting the millions of Americans who rely on protections for coverage. It isn't about ensuring families who are hit with tragedy that they have the means to care for their loved ones. It's a talking point, a punching bag they use at the expense of Americans in need of insurance. Why else would they aggressively market a form of coverage that is such a poor substitute for comprehensive insurance that the name itself is short-term? I am a big proponent of federalism and state regulation. I was the chairman of the New York State Insurance Committee for a number of years. But I'll admit, when I came to Washington just a few months ago, I'd never heard the term short-term insurance plans. My home state of New York prohibits short-term limited duration insurance explicitly because the state long ago recognized the predatory nature of such plans that target vulnerable consumers with misleading benefit details. And while I support federalism and state regulation, setting a floor here for what is in the interest of American consumers is paramount. Meanwhile, we see the administration marketing these plans as a cheaper alternative to the ACA, leaving those who fall prey to those low prices unaccountable for large, potentially financially crushing medical bills and leaving consumers vulnerable when they are most in need of medical attention. Short-term limited duration insurance, particularly when used as a substitute for meaningful coverage, leaves consumers at serious risk of financial burden and uncomprehensive health care options. I'm proud to join with my colleagues, Mr. Chair, in supporting this bill. I look forward to a favorable vote out of the committee, and I oppose this amendment and support the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Others want to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Plano, Texas, I went and priced the Affordable Care Act for my family of 5. It's $15,000 annual premium, $15,000 deductible. The definition of middle class is, $35,000 to $100,000, depending if they're lower middle class or upper middle class. But let's take upper middle class. If you make $100,000 a year and you live in Plano, Texas, and your health care cost is $30,000 a year, it's unaffordable. It's unaffordable. I appreciate the sentiments that have been expressed here, we need affordable insurance. This bill seems to strike down one option that creates some kind of affordability, because clearly the Affordable Care Act is unaffordable intrinsically. Is there some place that my constituents don't know to go shop to get affordable insurance? Is there some place that we don't know about? Because my constituents, the number one thing I heard when I ran for Congress was, I have been taken off the plan I could afford. I am forced to buy a plan I cannot afford. I don't have insurance for my family. I'll yield to any member of this committee that can tell me where my constituents can buy affordable insurance. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Florida.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
The bill before our committee today, H.R. 1010, does away with the mean-spirited Trump administration rule that allows short-term health insurance plans to offer inadequate health coverage and avoid insuring many pre-existing conditions. As chair of the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, protecting and improving access to affordable health care coverage is a major priority for me. Protecting the provision in the Affordable Care Act that enables people with pre-existing conditions to access care is paramount to achieving that goal. Nearly 8 million people in my home state of Florida have pre-existing conditions and are at risk of being discriminated against without this protection. Before the ACA became law, insurance companies could deny coverage to them and millions of Americans across the nation who suffer from a range of conditions such as asthma, diabetes, cancer, and more. Those lucky enough to secure health insurance were even forced to pay much higher premiums and out-of-pocket costs to cover a pre-existing condition. The inability to pay these higher fees and out-of-pocket costs was tantamount to a death sentence. The Affordable Care Act is not a panacea, yet when our colleagues across the aisle were in charge, instead of finding ways to improve the law and augment consumer protections that help to preserve the lives of our constituents and theirs, they voted 70 times to repeal all or parts of it. The most vulnerable communities have the most to lose when Republicans threaten the ACA. It's the family raising a child with an autoimmune disease, the working-class single mother whose employer doesn't offer insurance, the cancer survivor who fears a relapse. Democrats may debate the details, but we are united in our commitment to increasing and improving access to affordable health care and lower prescription drug prices. Many in the district I represent are heavily reliant on the ACA. My district also is among those with the highest number of ACA signups. Short-term limited duration insurance plans were designed to provide health insurance coverage for up to 3 months, not 12, and definitely not 36 months, as the Trump administration would like them to be. Allowing these so-called junk plans to expand undermines the ACA and adversely affects the healthcare market as a whole by permitting healthier consumers to leave the ACA marketplace and enroll in short-term plans that lack critical protections. For these reasons, I strongly encourage my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 1010, defend the ACA, and preserve and protect insurance coverage of the millions of Americans who have pre-existing conditions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Rowe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And look, I think everyone on this committee wants to have affordable coverage that's expanded. That was one of the things that was the premise of the ACA. If it had done that, I think we could have all supported it. But let's look at what happened. The CBO estimated that there'd be 22 to 24 million people that got their insurance through the exchange. It turned out that number's maybe 10, maybe. And in my state, we had a plan called Cover Tennessee in Tennessee, where the employer put $50 in, the employee put $50 in, and the state put $50 in. There were about 30,000 of our fellow Tennesseans that could afford this insurance. The ACA did away with all of that. In many of my counties now, we have one option, or maybe two, and what were happening, people, as my colleague, Mr. Taylor said, many people were paying the penalty and then buying non-ACA compliant insurance so they would have some kind of coverage. 15,000 in the 1st Congressional District. I challenge you to go to your districts and ask people what's going on. How many, let me see a show of hands in here. How many of you have ACA insurance? I do. I've had 2 major operations in the last 2.5 years. One would give me a pre-existing condition, a cancer operation. When I looked at the price of the premium that I paid and what it cost me to have that operation, I would have been thousands of dollars better off just to have written a check to the hospital. I didn't have insurance coverage. I had a card. I actually would have been better off to have kept the money and paid for the operation myself. I had a catastrophic plan. What do you say to the business owner in my district who's not a 6-figure income business owner? And for his family, it's $33,000, but he makes too much money to get any subsidy. If you get a subsidy on the plan, it's a good deal for you. I will acknowledge that. And 87% of people who get the insurance through the ACA get that. What we're trying to say is, look, there are people that are falling through the cracks, Let the state decide if they can help these people by allowing them to have this plan, of which, by the way, has been there for over 20 years, that you can access this plan so that you can get some peace of mind in your family if you happen to come up with cancer like I did, that you have some peace of mind that I won't be bankrupt, that I'll lose my small business. And there are a lot of individuals out there and small businesses who are being left behind by ACA coverage. And I would encourage my colleagues to work with us if it's an association health plan. And Mr. Chairman, you know I have tremendous respect for you. I would strongly disagree that people are being turned away. And just for the record, so that everyone understands this, it is against the law right now if you sell group insurance to a group, or you have a self-insured plan by ERISA since 1974, to discriminate based on a pre-existing condition. It is against the law to discriminate if you get Medicare or Medicaid. So it only leaves the small group or individual market. And look, I don't know why we didn't do this years ago, why we just didn't apply ERISA law to the individual and small group market if you sell that in a state. We can do that. So I think we need to work together. There are people that have fallen through the cracks. I think we need to acknowledge that. There are not just a few. There are thousands out there in my state. I think the number was 160,000 that paid the penalty in 2017. So we need to think about those folks too. And I want one last question answered. In Texas, where do you go to find affordable coverage? That was a reasonable question. I did not hear the answer to that question. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment because it would allow problematic short-term plans to continue. And I want to say that the Affordable Care Act has been the law for nearly a decade, yet today we have an administration that unfortunately is more interested in chipping away at the ACA than in making sure that every American has quality, affordable health insurance that provides reasonable and reliable coverage when it matters most. I support this legislation to reject the administration's rule on short-term limited duration insurance because these junk plans allow companies to discriminate based on gender, age, or health status, providing little or no coverage to those who really need it. These short-term plans might look very enticing to someone who does not foresee needing health services anytime soon, but no one ever plans on a catastrophic injury or expects a cancer diagnosis. Early in my career, I worked at Legal Aid, where I saw firsthand how emotionally and financially devastating it could be to face an unexpected medical emergency. All too often, these stories ended in bankruptcy or financial crisis. And if not for the Affordable Care Act, that's exactly what would have happened to Melissa from Beaverton, Oregon. Before the ACA was implemented, Melissa was divorced and unemployed. She was unable to get comprehensive health coverage because of a pre-existing condition. As Melissa tells it, I ended up buying catastrophic health insurance that cost $600 a month with virtually no benefits. After Obamacare, even though I didn't qualify for subsidies, I've found good health insurance at the same price or less. I see a physician I like. My blood pressure medications are very affordable. As Melissa indicated, these short-term policies typically do not cover essential benefits, like prescription drugs. They often have annual caps that leave consumers responsible for the full cost of care. It was fortunate for Melissa that she didn't need hospital care during that time, because the average cost of a 3-day hospital stay is about $30,000, but some of these junk plans will cover only $1,000 per day. The skimpy plans this bill seeks to prohibit leave too many consumers stressed and in debt. They undermine the individual markets built to protect Americans from unpredictable and sometimes sudden changes in their health care needs. If we truly want our constituents to have access to affordable health care, we must make sure that the law does not allow insurers to sell junk plans that fail to include basic protections that provide access to life-saving care. So I oppose this amendment, but support the underlying bill, H.R. 1010, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I speak this morning in support of H.R. 1010, which would ensure that the Trump administration's short-term limited duration insurance rule would have no force or effect. Healthcare is a basic human need. This Trump administration rule is part of the long-term Republican effort to sabotage the Affordable Care Act, destabilize our healthcare system, and deny health insurance to those with pre-existing conditions. Short-term, limited duration insurance should be just that, for a short-term and of limited duration. The Obama administration capped these at 3 months. The Trump administration wants to extend them to up to 12 months, with plans renewable for up to 36 months. These plans, which are exempt from the consumer protections of the Affordable Care Act, offer consumers with little financial protection from high health care costs. They should be available to fill a gap in coverage for a limited time and should not be expanded to compete in the insurance market against fuller, more robust, and necessary health care coverage that comply with federal consumer protections. These plans can place individuals with a pre-existing condition at risk. They can rescind or deny coverage based on that pre-existing condition, leaving the individual with no coverage at all. And those individuals whose coverage was rescinded could be barred from reapplying once the short-term plan expires, leaving them without coverage until the next open enrollment season. We do not have Obamacare exchanges in the Marianas, but this administration's rule on short-term limited duration plans could impact some people in my district who seek individual insurance. My constituents and all Americans deserve better. They can deserve access to affordable health care insurance with guaranteed basic health care benefits, no risk of going broke from high deductible and out-of-pocket costs, whether or not they have a pre-existing condition. This bill before us this morning is a good bill. I therefore urge my colleague to support H.R. 1010 and yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Others want to speak? Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Please, recognized.
This amendment preserves a state option which would allow discrimination against pre-existing conditions. I want to point out that a wide range of consumer and patient groups, including AARP, the American Cancer Society, Action Network, the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, are all united in support of this bill. As well, I am too, and I speak in strong support of it, and commend our committee for debating and marking it up quickly because time is of the essence. We know about the other side of the aisle's constant war against the Affordable Care Act. Over 70 times they voted to either repeal, modify, or limit ACA's protections and reach. And now with a Democratic majority in the House, we see the administration looking to promote junk health care plans and even forgo their basic responsibility to defend the ACA in court. And the fact of the matter is, the administration's actions on health care have done nothing but limit coverage and make Americans sicker. We've seen the numbers since the Trump administration has assumed office. The percentages of Americans without health insurance has risen almost 3% after years of decline. The other side of the aisle has continued to remark about how premiums in the ACA individual market have increased. But what they fail to mention is that the administration has repealed key subsidies that made premiums more affordable, have cut back on outreach that encouraged people to apply, which reduces market prices, and have tried to require sick Americans to work in order to receive Medicaid. All of this combined to provide a weaker healthcare system than before. And nowhere is it more apparent than in the administration's support for short-term, limited duration health plans, plans that return us back to the pre-ACA days of coverage limits with discriminatory practices against those with pre-existing conditions. So I'm glad that our committee is standing up and saying that enough is enough. Today, we're sending a message that we believe in access to quality health care and that it is a human right, and that we will stand against all attempts to limit this right to only the healthiest and the wealthiest among us. And so, Mr. Chairman, I urge support for H.R. 1010. I support it, and I certainly hope that the committee will vote for it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Others want to speak on the bill? Gentlelady from Illinois, lead co-sponsor of the legislation, Ms. Underwood.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady.
Thank you. This was my first bill in Congress. I'm so excited to be here today to help move this bill forward and protect people with pre-existing health conditions. I'm so thankful to the chairman and to my colleagues in this committee who worked with me to introduce the bill. H.R. 1010 does help people with pre-existing conditions by overturning an administration rule, expanding junk insurance plans, which don't have to offer basic consumer protections to patients. No guaranteed maternity care, prescription drug coverage, or coverage if you're hospitalized. Let me tell you, there's a reason that we call them junk plans. A pre-existing condition shouldn't be some kind of a scarlet letter Americans have to wear around their neck as they try to get the quality, affordable health care that everyone deserves. No person in this country should be denied insurance coverage as a result of a pre-existing condition. Mr. Chairman, this bill is about promises kept. Let's do what we were sent to Congress to do and make sure it passes today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to the amendment.
Ladies recognized.
Mr. Chairman, in my judgment, health insurance plans that don't cover pre-existing conditions and don't have caps on out-of-pocket spending are in fact fake health insurance plans. You cannot have health insurance if you don't cover pre-existing conditions. In answer to the question about Texas, a state that I love, Texas has the highest uninsured rates in the country. This bill does not help Texas. If Texas had expanded the Medicaid plan, they would have reduced the number of uninsured by a quarter. The problem Texas has in every other state that has not expanded Medicaid, including my own, is that those people who don't have health insurance, particularly health insurance that covers all medically necessary services, they're cost shifting onto the rest of us that do have health insurance, particularly for those of us that don't get subsidies. As a result, health insurance becomes more expensive for middle-class people that need to move into the insurance market.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I will.
Mr. Chairman.
I yield.
Thank you. I think what you're saying, unfortunately, is factually flawed. So there were 4 states in approximately 2000 that did Medicaid expansion, right? So Arizona, Oregon, Maine, and Delaware. And in all 4 of those states, the Medicaid populations grew and the privately insured people declined so that the uninsured percentage actually stayed the same in all 4 of those states after 10 years. And so if you want to have more people covered, and the uncompensated care increased, for instance, in Maine, 300% in that same decade. So if you, those are the facts. There's no editorial there.
Well, we'll go back on the facts, but the issue is more complicated in those states. The point is that Texas has the highest uninsured rate in the country, and Medicaid expansion would have helped. But the fundamental point is, if we all don't have insurance, if we're all not sharing the cost of insurance, then health insurance goes up for the rest of us. And that's the fundamental point, and that's why I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to the bill, to the amendment? Gentlelady from Minnesota.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. I would like to thank the chairman for holding a markup on this very important piece of legislation. I'd like to echo with what many of my colleagues have said today, that the short-term, limited duration insurance rule is nothing but the latest in a long series of attempts by President Trump and our friends on the right to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. Affordable and quality health care is a human right. And yet, at every turn, this administration seeks to strip that right away from more and more Americans. The so-called short-term limited duration insurance plans offer minimal care and little to no financial protection for consumers, which is why they are meant to be just that, short-term. Expanding them will put more patients at risk and increase healthcare costs across the board. My constituents can't afford that, and they don't want that. So I'm proud to be voting in favor of HR 1010 today, blocking this appalling rule from going into effect. It's not only the moral choice, it's the smart choice. So thank you, Chairman, and all of the co-sponsors of this bill. I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to the gentleman from California?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I just want to point out that this is the latest of, well, not the latest, it's among the many ways in which the Trump administration has tried to undermine and sabotage the Affordable Health Care and Consumer Protection Law. Now, as mentioned before by one of my colleagues on the other side, that the enrollment was about 10 million individuals at most. But let's remember that the enrollment was steadily increasing as more and more Americans began to understand the consumer protections offered by the ACA. And that when this administration took office, they deliberately and intentionally restricted or cut off the funds to market the ACA. So people would not understand and find out about the benefits of the ACA, and enrollments began to slow. You know, to make all this work, we need more and more enrollments, especially among younger people. And the whole idea is to get more money into the insurance pool to pay out the benefits. We do have a challenge in trying to control the first dollar costs of medical insurance under the ACA. But that's, you know, the sabotaging of this administration to not even let people know and to not aggressively market these plans so that more and more people can join these insurance plans. Insurance plans under the ACA, which have essential health benefits. As stated by my colleague from Florida, these short-term plans or plans that don't meet the 10 essential health benefits are fake insurance plans, where you have to read the fine print to understand what it is you're being covered for. We don't want to go back to the days when insurance plans had yearly caps. You find out that you run out of money and the insurance company won't reimburse you for expenses if you've gone over a certain amount, and lifetime caps. You know, you hit a certain limit for over a lifetime, and insurance company says, you know, your $100,000 cancer treatment regime is not covered by your policy. These are the sort of things that happen in plans that are allowed to go around the essential health benefits that we established under the ACA. I'd like to yield 30 seconds to my colleague from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Takano. I just wanted to point out, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle mentioned my home state of Oregon as a state that did not reduce the uninsured rates with Medicaid expansion. Before the ACA and Medicaid expansion, we had about a 15% uninsured rate. We now have about a 6% uninsured rate. So I just want to get that on the record, that we did, in fact, significantly reduce the number of uninsured in Oregon. Thank you, and I yield back to Mr. Takano.
And let me just say that in my own district, we cut the uninsured rate by over half. So it significantly affected the ability of my constituents to obtain insurance. And I remember a phone call that I had with somebody just shy, 2 or 3 years shy of qualifying for Medicaid. And they were grateful because insurance becomes extremely expensive at that time in life. And with their cost-sharing subsidy, they were able to get affordable insurance, good insurance that covered their benefits. Now, let me just say one more thing. This states' rights thing is, I was a local government official. I understand the federalism issue, but I find it boneheaded that huge states have refused the Medicaid expansion. 3 states, since in the last elections, have passed referenda to expand Medicaid. To expand Medicaid in their states, and they have legislatures that are trying to impede that or compromise what the people in those states want. So I don't understand folks that want to deny coverage to people and make it harder for people to get insurance, or to give them fake plans that you have to read the fine print to understand. I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak? Gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last words.
Gentlelady is recognized.
As a two-time breast cancer survivor, I understand what it means to have your life turned upside down by a diagnosis. And I am one of nearly 130 million Americans living with a pre-existing condition. I truly do not know what would have happened to me or my family if I didn't have my health coverage during my cancer treatments. Now, I was lucky. Americans who are covered by short-term, limited duration plans are not. These plans offer limited benefits and little financial protection. These are junk plans, and they do not provide adequate protections for our constituents with pre-existing conditions. The National Association of Insurance Commissioners recently released a report on these short-term junk plans. They found that enrollment in these plans is likely increasing, which is very alarming. But what's even more alarming is that most consumers do not understand what is covered and what is not covered. Quote, consumers did not understand the short-term plan because they've been shaped by their experience and expectations of the market since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, end quote. I'd like to say that H.R. 10 would protect our constituents from these junk health plans, and I urge my colleagues, please, to support this bill. I yield back the rest of my
Gentlelady's time has expired. Anyone else? And I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. Just to briefly say that the Affordable Care Act provides certain consumer protections, particularly protections for those with pre-existing conditions. This amendment allows states the option of denying that protection. Now, the basic protection for those with pre-existing conditions is the ability to get insurance at the standard rate, notwithstanding the pre-existing condition. If you can start discriminating against people, as these junk plans allow you to do, people without pre-existing conditions can pay less. People with pre-existing conditions will pay a lot more if they can buy any insurance at all. Every time some state has tried to provide a guaranteed issue to those with pre-existing conditions without a mandate and subsidies like we have in the Affordable Care Act, have found the system to spiral out of control. Costs go up, healthy people drop out, and costs keep going up until nobody can buy insurance. That's what happened in Washington State. That's what was about to happen in New York State when the Affordable Care Act came in. The cost, they had a guaranteed issue without any mandates or subsidies. When the Affordable Care Act came in, the premiums for individual insurance dropped more than 50%. And so this would just remove those protections and put us in a situation where if people with pre-existing conditions can get insurance, the costs will more than likely be unaffordable. We've heard about the situation where people making more than $100,000 have affordability problems. There is legislation pending that will deal with that, that will have, if you make more than $100,000, you drop off the cliff and you're paying sticker price for the insurance. Legislation would allow you to pay a percentage of your income. At some point in your income, that percentage, about 8.5%, will cover the sticker price. But you will always be at that percentage of your income, and so health insurance would be affordable. Meanwhile, this amendment would allow states to deny people, deny people the benefits that they have under the Affordable Care Act, and I would hope we would defeat the amendment. Are there other comments? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for a recorded vote, please.
The recorded vote is requested, and pursuant to the previous comments, that vote will be rolled to the end. Are there other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Wahlberg. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1010, offered by Mr. Wahlberg.
Gentleman is recognized on his amendment. Before he speaks, the gentleman from Connecticut.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Reserves a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. little less than a week ago, I was involved in a 19-hour markup in Energy and Commerce Committee on this specific topic as being one of the key points that we were addressing in bills before us that day, including these short-term plans, which is Energy and Commerce jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of this committee, however, is employer-sponsored health insurance, ERISA, where 158 million Americans currently receive their health insurance coverage. And of those 158 million Americans who currently receive their coverage under those plans, most are extremely pleased with that coverage. Our focus should be improving these options and ensuring that employers can continue to offer high-quality, low-cost plans for their workers. Instead, we are here today to consider H.R. 1010 outside of our jurisdiction, which would prevent consumers from purchasing short-term, limited-duration plans that most don't see as junk plans. They choose to purchase it to meet the needs that they have that they aren't finding under the ACA. These plans offer an affordable and flexible plan option for Americans struggling to afford coverage in the individual market. There may be 10 million additional consumers who have an insurance plan. The problem is they don't have the coverage when they go to use it, or they can't afford it. Democrats disagree with allowing more options for consumers, and that's why they're pushing a bill that eliminates affordable options in favor of one-size-fits-all government-mandated coverage by repealing a Trump administration regulation. The Trump administration rule provided clarity regarding short-term limited duration plans and was issued in large part to overturn a midnight regulation issued in the final days of the Obama administration. This midnight rule was a last-minute ploy to restrict these plans that had been legal during President Obama's entire term in office. H.R. 1010 is a one-sentence bill that will not lower drug prices, will not protect anyone from surprise medical bills, will not lower premiums, will not cut out any out-of-pocket expenses, and will not provide any tax relief. That's a fact. Read the bill. One of the arguments we've heard here today is that consumers do not have enough information about short-term limited duration plans, and that they may be surprised to find out what benefits or services may not be covered. We want consumers to have affordable choices. They also must be able to make informed choices about exactly what they are buying. Truthfully, Mr. Chairman, I understand that this bill is simply a messaging bill with no expectation that it'll ever become law, because it won't. This amendment would require, that I have before you, would require the Secretaries of Health and Human Services, Labor, and the Treasury to conduct a study to determine whether consumers are provided with adequate information on coverage exclusions and premium variations. The study would examine a variety of sources such as marketing resources, consumer application, and enrollment materials. If the study finds that these materials do not provide sufficient consumer information on these plans, then the bill will take effect in 90 days. Otherwise, if the study finds consumer information is sufficient, the bill will not go into effect. If the reason behind this bill is that Democrats believe that consumers are not making informed choices about these plans, then they should have no objection to this amendment. This is a simple, I guess, transparency type amendment that says, let's do what's advisable for our consumers. Let's not waste time on legislation that will not have impact and, in fact, will not help the consumer. So I ask my colleagues to support this legislation, that propose a study to get the facts out, and then make the determination whether the bill is needed or not based upon what the facts are. And I yield back.
Time has expired. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to the amendment. Thank you. I certainly welcome my Republican colleagues' newfound interest in improving disclosure and highlighting the comprehensiveness of coverage offered through the ACA. But the very fact that we're having to introduce this amendment on the bill really strikes me as acknowledging that we don't have a good situation here, and that bringing this bill forward is the only way of continuing the kind of coverage that's there. The reality is that, it's just incompatible to have short-term plans and protect pre-existing conditions. It's almost impossible to do that, and that's why after so much time spent trying to craft a healthcare legislation that works for people, the ACA was the only way that could really be done, because we know that short-term plans can be sold by brokers, but it's just wishful thinking. It's wishful thinking that you can have both. So I certainly acknowledge the effort here, but
Would the gentlelady
we
yield?
just can't have the two working simultaneously.
Will gentlelady yield?
I will yield for a second if the gentleman wants to make a comment.
I appreciate that very much. If indeed pre-existing conditions were covered sufficiently under ACA, we wouldn't be needing short-term plans. That's the challenge that we have here. People looking for a way to cover things that they can't find covered or have the ability to pay for in ACA, and that's our concern. We want pre-existing conditions covered.
Reclaiming my time. I mean, I think what you're suggesting there is that we just don't cover pre-existing conditions at all, rather than suggesting, as you are, that it's partial. I think if you look
I wouldn't suggest
and
that.
talk to your consumers in your district and constituents, they are so grateful. The stories abound for what has happened to people under the ACA. There's just no way that could be. And I think we all have personal examples in our families. I certainly do, heartbreaking ones. And so I think we have to be very, very careful how we try and craft this and think that, it's okay. We can move forward, short-term plans. The reality is that companies that have short-term plans, if they actually tried to cover pre-existing conditions, would probably not be able to do that. And in fact, many of them went bankrupt. So I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Other comments? I recognize myself very briefly to comment against the amendment. We don't have to wait for a study. We know that the programs, these plans are being sold in a deceptive way. According to independent experts at Georgetown University, they found, and I quote, consumers shopping online for health insurance will, more often than not, find websites and brokers selling short-term plans as a replacement for ACA-compliant coverage. These websites and brokers often fail to provide consumers with the detailed plan information necessary to inform their purchase. Most often, brokers push consumers to purchase a plan over the phone without seeing written information or time to think about the decision. The other problem with so we don't need to wait. We know they're being sold deceptively, but even if they weren't deceptive, the entire basis of the plan, if they tell the truth, they'll show that for those with pre-existing conditions, costs will go up and the protections will go down. If you don't have a pre-existing condition, then you might save a little money short-term until you get sick, and then you're back in the pool with everybody else. So the fact is, one, they're deceptive, and two, even if they weren't deceptive, it'd still be a bad idea. And this amendment would allow the bill to go forward so long as they have written documentation that's accurate, but it won't reflect the fact that those with pre-existing conditions are losing their protections. Are there other comments? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. The noes appear to have it.
Request a record roll call
Roll call vote is requested. That vote pursuant to procedure will be rolled to the end. Are there other amendments? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 1010, offered by Mr. Wright.
Gentlelady from Oregon, Reserves a point of order.
Mr. Chair, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would allow the sale of short-term limited duration plans in counties where the average benchmark premium increases by 20% or more in a year. This preserves choice and balances consumer needs with their desire for affordable coverage. Let me repeat what I believe is the most salient point made by the ranking Republican in her opening remarks. H.R. 1010 is a one-sentence bill that will not lower drug prices, will not protect anyone from surprise medical bills, will not lower premiums, will not cut out any out-of-pocket cost, and will not provide any tax relief. And these are the issues that should command the attention of the Congress, because these are the issues that the American people demand be fixed. Democrats disagree with allowing more options for consumers, and that's why they're pursuing a bill that eliminates affordable options in favor of one-size-fits-all government-mandated coverage by repealing a Trump administration regulation. Healthcare costs are one of the top areas of concern for my constituents and most American families. According to data from the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services, after the Affordable Care Act regulations took effect in 2014, average individual market premiums more than doubled from $2,784 per year in 2013 to $5,712 in 2017, an increase of 105%. Thanks to the immediate actions taken by the Trump administration to address skyrocketing costs and market stability, CMS announced the first decrease in average premiums for individual market plans. This should be good news for everyone, both Democrats and Republicans. We should hope that this trend continues, but if for some reason it does not and consumers are once again faced with double-digit premium increases, we want to ensure there are affordable and flexible plans available. I urge the members of this committee to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back the rest of my time.
Much time has expired. Anyone wish to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from Illinois.
I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to the amendment.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With short-term plans, you get what you pay for. These plans leave Americans on the hook for thousands of dollars of health care costs, jeopardizing families' economic security. We just heard Mr. Wright say that it does not protect people from surprise medical bills, and unfortunately, sir, that's just not true. Short-term plans set arbitrary dollar amounts for health care services, leading to large surprise bills for consumers. Many consumers enroll in the short-term plans after being led to believe that they're purchasing comprehensive policies, full coverage, when they are not. These consumers are then faced with high out-of-pocket costs and massive debt when they discover that the junk plan does not cover their medical conditions. Short-term plans discriminate, charging higher costs to consumers based on factors that they can't control, including their age, gender, and health status. And these short-term plans will particularly hurt the 133 million Americans living with a pre-existing condition. That is what this bill gets to, protecting pre-existing conditions for the American people and making their health care more affordable in the process. These ACA plans that we talk about are subsidized to help consumers offset the cost of adequate comprehensive health care coverage, and that is what we should be aiming for. And with that, sir, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is super personal for me. Essentially, what we did with the Affordable Care Act is set a floor of decency. That's what they're calling one size fits all, a floor of basic decency for health care plans in our country. And this amendment and others being proposed would rip up that floor. Our bill, H.R. 1010, is about protecting American families from junk health plans, temporary, otherwise, that would take away that floor. We're talking about plans that can deny consumers coverage or charge them more based on their age, gender, or health status. We're talking about plans that have no guarantee of coverage for basic benefits, such as maternity care, mental health care, prescription drugs, or preventive services. Put another way, plans that aren't giving you value for your money. They're junk. These plans could also rescind or deny coverage for care that may stem from a pre-existing condition. Mr. Chairman, I'm a 2-time cancer survivor, and 2 of my 4 kids have Crohn's disease, and they've had it for 13 years. They're 25 and 23, and they were diagnosed at 11 and 9. If my family were to get a plan like this, we could end up on the hook for care that we need. That's just not going to work for us, and I'm not about to let it happen to other families like mine, millions of other families like mine across this country either. The Trump administration has tried again and again to gut the protections Americans were given through the Affordable Care Act, and letting consumers get stuck with junk health care plans was part of that effort. Today, when we pass this bill, we're showing the American people that those days are over, and that's why we need to defeat this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Other comments? Gentleman from Tennessee?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Look, I agree with a lot of what I've heard on both sides of the aisle. The problem with health insurance coverage is affordability. That's the problem. And that's what we're trying for some people who can't afford it. We've said to them, you can just do without. If you're subsidized, it's a good deal for you. And there's no question. Look, I have dealt with pre-existing conditions for over almost 4 decades of my life as a physician. In the state of Tennessee, in 2018, the benchmark price for ACA insurance coverage was increase of 56%. I'm glad to report that they overshot. Thank goodness they did. And in our state, the premiums on the benchmark price dropped 12% for 2019. I'm very pleased to say that. But a 56% increase, if you're protected by a subsidy, that's fine. It doesn't cost you anything. But if you're a small business person or you're paying full freight, you cannot afford it. So what do you say to those folks? And for instance, in my home area of Tri-Cities, Tennessee, there are 2 insurance companies you can get it from. Not 29 like you can Medicare Part D, 2. And in 2018, everybody pulled out of Knoxville, and thank goodness Blue Cross went back into Knoxville so they would have an ACA option there, and I think another insurer has also gone in. So it's a little more complicated than these talking points we're talking about. We need to work together. This is a great common sense thing for somebody to have another option when they have one they cannot afford. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Other comments? Gentlelady from Michigan? Washington? Excuse me. Gentlelady from Washington?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Affordability isn't affordability just in a vacuum. Affordability is whether you can afford an insurance plan that really takes care of you. And these plans are unaffordable, these junk plans, because they provide nothing, even though the cost is low. And frankly, we can't afford those sorts of plans. But I've been hearing a lot about affordability of health care, and I just would love to invite any of you to join us on some bills that we've introduced that really do get to the heart of affording insurance premiums. One of them we came out with just last week that extends subsidies up to 600% of the poverty level that is being worked on in energy and commerce right now. It also makes sure no family pays more than 8.5% of their income on insurance. That, in my district, would cut insurance rates in half for a family of 4. And in addition, I have co-sponsored a bill that will give people the opportunity, if they live in an area with only 0 or 1 providers, like you were just talking about, to buy into Medicaid, which is another affordable option. So, today's topic is about these junk plans, these short-term plans that provide no coverage, and frankly, we can't afford those. And for affordability in general, I would encourage you to please work with us, because we have great plans on how to shore up the Affordable Care Act and make it better. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Other comments? Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to talk on this. I mean, part of the friction here is the fact that, the Affordable Care Act was done in a single party, partisan way, unfortunately. A lot of dynamics there. There were a few of us who were there when that occurred. I don't believe in replowing old fields, so it is what it is, except to say that under the Affordable Care Act, for whatever it did and didn't do, it left tens of millions of Americans behind. And I would caution all of my colleagues from speaking with arrogance about consumer choice, about individuals making informed decisions. I've practiced healthcare for 28 years. Informed consent is important. It's an obligation. It's actually the law when it comes to cost. Although as healthcare professionals don't do a real good job of pointing out what costs are always when choices are made. But I think the arrogance, I hear this term junk thrown around, and I think that's insulting to the tens of millions of Americans who are exercising consumer choice and are, as they should, reading the fine details and making an informed decision of what they're purchasing. You know, junk is defined as something that's useless, by Webster, useless or little value. Well, that's obviously not the case for a lot of Americans. It may be the case for those of us sitting in here because we have other options, but not for tens of millions of Americans. And the ACA, whether we like it or not, whether you like it or not, support it or not, whatever, it has left tens of millions of Americans behind. It did some good things in terms of uninsured. 2013 estimated there were 44 million Americans, non-elderly, let's be clear about that, non-elderly, that were uninsured. In 2016, that improved dramatically, 27 million. But then starting in 2017, we've seen an uptick of nearly 700,000 added to the uninsured rolls in 2017. Studies have been done, at least one study has shown, and it makes sense, I think it's common sense, we would all understand that, for 45% of those tens of millions, almost wherever we're at, close to 30 million Americans who are uninsured today, 45% of uninsured adults remain uninsured because of, you can guess it, cost of coverage too high. So now this bill eliminates that option. We're not debating health care here, we're debating health insurance. And I think that whether you like the ACA, you didn't like the ACA, support it, you didn't support it, and the good things, the bad things, we ought to recognize that it has left tens of millions of Americans behind who want to make informed choices and decisions for their families. If you vote for this bill, I mean, there's a certain arrogance there of taking away choice from consumer choice. Now, we should certainly be encouraging everything we can for informed choice. I think there's a whole lot of folks signed up under the ACA who are shocked in the end of what they find out after they've bought it without reading the owner's manual first as well. So informed consent, informed decision-making is always important. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word and speak.
Ladies recognized.
Thank you. My colleague from Pennsylvania refers to choice and informed choice. And my concern about this amendment and why I am so much in favor of this bill is because health insurance is something that is uniquely weighted in favor of the entity that is providing the alleged coverage to the people that it's supposedly insuring. I don't think that this bill in any way insults the American people or people who are seeking to become insured. It is simply a bill that is designed to make sure that consumers are not sold a bill of goods. And that, frankly, is what I think is happening with these plans. There is no plans that provide Americans with more choice or freedom, as you claim, but don't cover anything. That's not a choice. And the problem is that in reading insurance policies, which very, very few people do, you are at the mercy of the entity that is providing the policy to tell you what it contains. I'm a lawyer, have been for more than 30 years. I've read more than my share of insurance policies of all kinds. I can tell you that even to somebody trained to read these documents, they are very, very difficult to understand. And so I think that this bill is absolutely essential. I believe that the proposal, the amendment, is a further effort to sabotage
the Affordable Care Act, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I wanted to follow up on my colleague from the state of Washington, whom I deeply respect. I wanted to touch upon the affordability piece. I would urge you and our colleagues across the aisle to also look at some of our proposals that we've put forward that introduce greater flexibility, more options, with the goal of lowering cost, having a more dynamic marketplace, which will ultimately lead to better quality. There are also bipartisan proposals. There's a bill that I've introduced with Brad Schneider to require insurance to cover 2 primary care visits per year, which is a good investment per preventative care. But on the affordability piece, I wanted to speak as a consumer who's been covered by the Affordable Care Act. I was one of those that raised their hand when Mr. Taylor spoke. And my personal experience was that it was very much unaffordable. I had a breast cancer scare. I had a mammogram, ultrasounds, and 2 biopsies with 2 follow-ups. Out of pocket, in addition to my monthly premiums, that cost over $5,000. I was in a position to be able to pay that bill and work to balance my household's family budget, but many of the constituents that I represent will not be able to afford that out of cost. So this discussion on affordability is critical. I think there's an opportunity to find bipartisan solutions, but I thought it was important to share that personal story from someone who has been on Obamacare. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that Democrats love freedom as much as I do, but to hear some of them talk, they think freedom's a terrible thing, because that's what this bill is really about. It's government control over freedom of choice. We had, we learned from the state of New York earlier that that state chose to eliminate this as an option. They were able to do that because the state of New York, under the law, had the freedom to do it. And yet you want to deny that freedom to other states. And now we have Democrats trying to redefine decency. Really? I'll tell you what indecency is. It's continuing to diminish the freedom of the American people. That's indecent. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Oregon.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the point of order.
Thank you. I recognize myself for comments. You know, it's interesting that we're talking about the cost, because this very amendment will actually increase cost. It says it's only eligible when the costs have gone up 20%. I just want to remind people what was happening to cost when we passed the Affordable Care Act. Costs were going through the roof. The costs after the Affordable Care Act passed continued to go up, but at the lowest rate in 50 years. There's one thing to complain about the Affordable Care Act and how unaffordable it is. Health insurance is unaffordable for anybody anyway. But the alternative, the plan passed by the Republican House, would have had a 20% increase in cost and premiums the first year. It would limit the essential benefits covered. 20-some million fewer people would have insurance, and those with pre-existing conditions would start losing their coverage. This amendment would apply in those areas where the costs have gone up 20%. The effect is that it would go up more than that for most people if this amendment passed, because you can start discriminating against people with pre-existing conditions, and that might help those without pre-existing conditions. They might, in fact, pay a little less. But if you have a pre-existing condition, you're not going to be able to afford the insurance. Now, the problem we have is that these plans, if you are healthy, you don't think you're going to need long-term excessive costs, where a cap in annual benefits or a cap in lifetime benefits may be of interest to you. If you're not interested in that, if you're healthy, if you don't need maternity benefits, fine. You might save a little money. But if you're going to cover people for maternity benefits where it's a choice, not an overall mandate, if you're going to cover people with pre-existing conditions, then this will actually increase the cost for those in the insurance pool. And the fact that people understand what they're getting, they may fully understand that if you're healthy, you might pay a little less. But if you get sick, look out, because you're not going to be able to afford insurance. I would hope that this amendment would be defeated again and we could pass the bill. The other comments? If not, the question is on the amendments. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. Noes appear to have it. The noes have it.
I'd like a recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote is added to the list at the end. Another amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman from South Carolina. Mr. Timmons has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1010, offered by Mr. Timmons.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Included in the jurisdiction of this committee is employer-sponsored health insurance, where 158 million Americans currently receive their health insurance coverage. This committee should be focused on improving these options and ensuring that employers can continue to offer high-quality, low-cost plans for their workers. Instead, we are here today to discuss H.R. 1010, which would prevent consumers from purchasing short-term, limited-duration plans. These plans offer an affordable and flexible plan option for Americans struggling to afford coverage in the individual market. This bill eliminates affordable options in favor of one-size-fits-all, government-mandated coverage by repealing a Trump administration regulation. The Trump administration rule provided clarity regarding short-term, limited-duration plans, and it was issued in large part to overturn a midnight regulation issued in the final days of the Obama administration. The Obama midnight rule was a last-minute ploy to restrict these plans that had been legal during President Obama's entire term. H.R. 1010 is a one-sentence bill that will not lower drug prices, will not protect anyone from surprise medical bills, will not lower premiums, will not cut any out-of-pocket costs, and will not provide tax relief. When it comes to health insurance, cost is not the only concern. Many consumers who purchase exchange coverage have few plan options. From 2016 to 2017 alone, the number of insurance carriers offering plans on the exchange decreased by nearly 30%. In 2018, 56% of U.S. counties on the federal platform had only one issuer offering coverage. In 2019, the number of counties with one issuer dropped by 39%. We hope that these most recent trends continue. But if they do not, and consumers are once again faced with no alternative coverage options, we want to ensure that there are affordable and flexible plans available. This amendment would allow the sale of short-term, limited-duration plans in counties where fewer than two issuers offer coverage on the exchange. This preserves choice and balances consumers' needs with their desire for affordable coverage. I spoke earlier about all the things that this bill will not do. One more thing it will not do is that it will not be signed into law. It won't even get a hearing in the Senate. We are almost 100 days into the 116th Congress, and this committee has not had a policy-based discussion on anything that has a chance of becoming law. We have major problems facing this nation. $22 trillion of debt, an utterly broken immigration system, healthcare costs spiraling out of control. Neither political party will be able to fix these huge challenges on our own. Republicans and Democrats must work together to help move our country forward. Americans deserve better. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. It's a common-sense approach to making health care more affordable. It is only a small step, but is a step in the right direction. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does anyone wish to speak in opposition to the amendment? If not, I'll recognize myself. This actually makes it less likely that the amendment says if there are two or less that you can have these junk plans. This amendment will actually make it less likely that an insurance company will enter into a market where healthy people can end up with can get into these junk plans, that they can get into those plans where they will end up covering sicker and sicker people. That situation, and if they get in to a market where there are three plans and think they know what's going on, all of a sudden somebody else drops out after they're locked into the market, and healthy people bail and go into these junk plans, and they end up with a sicker market, when that possibility is there, that's when you really have insurance companies dropping out. In Virginia, we lost a lot of companies, and as they bailed out and said they weren't going to enter into the market, they mentioned specifically the unpredictability of the market because of the junk plans, because of the cost-sharing reduction payments. They didn't know what they were covering, and then they refused to get into the market. This amendment would put more pressure on insurance companies to stay out because they don't know what they're covering. And so you have a situation where you state a problem, but the solution actually makes things worse. The other comments?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. So I just wanted to submit for the record, if I could, to have unanimous consent, a series of census data information regarding Medicaid expansion in the 4 states I mentioned previously, including the state of Oregon, which in 2002 had 16% uninsured, and they did a Medicaid expansion that was a little bit different than the one the ACA did. So they expanded full able-bodied men and women 100% of federal poverty level and below. And 10 years later, in 2011, they still had 16% uninsured. So despite expanding Medicaid from 12% of the population to 18% of the population, so Medicaid went up, the private insurance dropped exactly as much as the public insurance went up. And so, and this data is available for all 4 states, if I could submit that in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested and will be voted on at the end. Are there other amendments? If there are no other amendments, we will, we have a list of the, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 amendments where roll calls have been requested. First amendment is the one offered by Mr. Johnson. We will vote on that now. The questions on the Johnson amendment, clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood?
No.
Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? No. Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro?
Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
The clerk will call the roll of those that did not answer the original roll call.
Mrs. Davis?
No.
Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Watkins?
Was Mr. Norcross recorded?
Mr. Norcross is not recorded.
Ms.
Mr. Norcross
Jayapal?
votes no.
Ms. Jayapal?
Ms. Jayapal is not recorded. Ms. Jayapal votes no.
Mr. Courtney?
Mr. Courtney is not recorded. Mr. Courtney votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 19 yeas, 25 nays.
Amendment is not adopted. The second amendment is the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mr. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Yes.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? The gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge, has she recorded?
Ms. Fudge is not recorded. Ms. Fudge votes no.
Anyone else not recorded? Clerk report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 19 yeas, 26 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright. Adds a new section that creates an exception to permit a short-term, limited duration insurance rule in a plan year for any rating area where the average premium in the second lowest silver plan increased by 20% or more relative to the previous year. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
The members who are not recorded? Any member not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 19 yeas, 26 nays.
The Wright amendment is not adopted. The final amendment.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Gentlelady from Oregon.
I request to be recognized for 1 minute.
Is there objection? Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did not object when our colleague from Texas introduced a document. Now that I've had an opportunity to look at it, I just want to get something on the record, which I may be supplementing with written material, but I want to make clear for the transcript that Oregon did do a limited Medicaid expansion before the ACA. It was very limited. It was by random lottery, but because of budget concerns, the program was scaled significantly back and then actually suspended from 2004 until 2008. The relevant facts are that after the Affordable Care Act, Oregon has significantly reduced the rates of uninsured from about 15% to about 6%. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity, and I yield back.
Thank you. The final amendment is offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons. Adds a new section that creates an exception to permit the short-term limited duration insurance rule in a local jurisdiction where there are fewer than 2 qualified health plan insurers in a plan year in that jurisdiction. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Garhalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 19 yeas, 26 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Before we get to final passage, I just want to repeat what I said at the beginning of the markup, that there's unfortunately a change in committee practice. The parliamentarian has instructed the committee that we cannot permit members to cast votes at the end of the markup and be counted in the tally. And so those committee members are just informed by the parliamentarian that we have to alter that practice. As before, if a member has missed a vote during markup, you may approach the clerk at the end of the markup and let the clerk know how you would have voted had you been present for the vote, and their voting preference will be indicated in the roll call tally. However, the difference will be that it will not count in the tally. This is a change in practice. Apparently, the parliamentarians were watching a markup and decided to inflict this on us. That had been the practice for years, but it is what it is.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Could we begin this practice next markup, because Watkins was not here and he's not aware of it?
The parliamentarian instructed us to change the process, so I'm not sure that we can entertain that. There'd be no other members to speak on the bill, and no amendments have been adopted. We'll now entertain a motion to report the bill. I recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 1010 to the House of Representatives, and with the recommendation that the bill be agreed to and the bill do pass.
Question now occurs on reporting H.R. 1010 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
Vinnie, the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Mrs. Stevens? Mrs. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Strahan? Mr. Strahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox?
No.
Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe?
Lovely, Bobby.
Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 26 yeas, 19 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1010 is reported to the House of Representatives. Chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I now recognize Ms. Underwood for a motion.
I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views.
Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business to come before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.